Hi everyone, my name is James Pham. I am the CEO and co-founder of Opsin. We save enterprises from data exposure risk using Microsoft Copilot. I have with me here my co-founder and CTO, Jeremy, just to talk and share a bit more on how do you succeed as an engineer in a startup. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, Jeremy?
Great, yeah, it's good to be here and have an opportunity to chat with everybody. I've been at 6 startups, including Opsin, in my career. You know, I moved out to the Bay Area around 2008, and I've been working at a series of startups since then, and I keep going earlier and earlier phase. I guess I got the bug for wanting to work at startups, and once you have that, you want to continue to work in that area. My background is as a programmer, so I learned to program when I was growing up, and that love of programming has been kind of carried through my entire life and my career.
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned this is your 6th startup, so you definitely kind of seen a lot of different patterns on like what different stages of startup require different skill sets. So you could share a little bit more on like your observations about engineers in startups and what's different stages and what it requires and how it is different from big companies. That would be awesome.
Yeah, for sure. You know, I probably didn't appreciate it when I first got started. In 2008, when I came to San Francisco, I was lucky enough to work at a startup called Vontu. They were in the data security space, and it was right before they got acquired by Symantec. And before that, I had worked at bigger companies. You know, I'd worked in defense contracting, and the environment really surprised me. The CEO of that company was a guy named Joseph Ancinelli, and he's been a partner at Greylock and some other VC firms. And it was really true what they say about culture eats strategy for breakfast. And of course, you know where culture comes from. It comes from the team that you hire. And I learned from him that his number one priority, like beyond everything else, like even beyond making customers happy, which is his number 2 super important priority, was to hire the best team that he could possibly get and treat them really well. Because you learn very quickly in a startup environment, things change very rapidly, and you have to have a team that's able to live in that world and thrive in that world, which is not easy.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you mentioned your transition from big company in defense industry into a startup. Like, what do you think would be the biggest difference, and what stage did you join Vontu?
Yeah, so they were right at the point of being acquired by Symantec at that time. So they had maybe 150 people. They had a very successful business. They had already built up their engineering culture. But even at that size, the biggest difference that I noticed was when you're doing federal contracting, everything is very much specified for you ahead of time. You know exactly what you need to build. Somebody tells you ahead of time how long it's going to take to build that thing. And you have none of that at a startup. You have product managers approaching you with a customer problem and asking, well, how do you think we should solve this? And you're like, wow, I have to invent a whole new solution. And then, of course, the second question is, when can you have it by? And you're like, oh boy, you know, how can I have this by next week? Because oftentimes you're shipping things that fast. You'll ship it next week. And that immediately surprised me when I got there. And also, you know, that's where you start to get the itch, because it's very exciting to be able to solve a customer problem and deliver it to them in the matter of a week or two.
Yeah, that makes sense. And when you said about like culture, eating strategy for breakfast, could you articulate a little bit more on what that means in the startup situation? Yeah.
For sure. Because things are so dynamic, you may try to come up with a strategy ahead of time, but you're going to find very quickly that strategy may not work out quite the way you expected it to. Yeah. And if you have a good team with a good culture and they have the context to do what's the right thing for the customer, they can figure those situations out. And it usually requires them to think in an unorthodox way. A strategy may define a very orthodox way of doing something, and that may, you know, when you're trying to do something that hasn't been done before at a startup, you can't always come up with a strategy ahead of time.
Yeah, that makes sense. A lot of things are uncertain, so it's hard to come up with like the thinking and the roadmap or the timeline. So that makes a lot of sense. Um, and then the other thing that you mentioned is hire the best team. So
Hmm.
in your opinion, like how do you define the best team? Because like I've heard many startup, like every startup say I want to hire the best team. And what is the best team here?
Yeah, I think there is some level of subjectivity to what it means to hire the best team and the best people.
Yeah.
But to me, it's people who have a deep curiosity and they're really engaged with the problem that you're solving at
Yeah.
that company. It's something that they just start digging into it on their own because it fascinates them and they want to solve it. And usually it is high achieving type people who have that DNA in them. But it's not always the person who had the best grades in school or maybe achieved all the accolades within their peer group. You know, I remember one of the chief architects at a previous startup that I worked at never even graduated from college.
Wow.
Like he was self-taught. He's just a really
Yeah.
brilliant guy when it came to reverse engineering and hacking things for security.
Yeah.
And to him, college didn't get him
Yeah.
to that fast enough, so he wanted to go directly to doing startups.
That's great to hear, and so like there's no one standard that say this is the best team, not the pedigree, not the experience.
Yeah.
By the way, for the audience listening to the webinar, like feel free to ask question in the comments, and we'll address that as they go, either in the comments or live. All right, so if there is no pedigree for you to kind of like judge who is the best engineer or best team out there, like when it comes to engineers that want to join the startup, like how would you evaluate those, and how would you say that, hey, this is the best engineer, this is the best teams that are out there? Like what kind of qualities that usually like, hey, you are made for startup, or versus like, hey, you're made for like a bigger companies and things like that? Like how would you kind of like give
Yeah.
some sort of rough idea about that?
Yeah, for sure. You know, one way you can look at it is you can look for people with prior startup experience. There's a little bit of a dual path thing where some people choose a larger company, large tech company ladder, and some choose to explore startups. But I don't want to judge just based on that, because I myself made that transition. You know, I worked for larger companies
Yeah.
and then went to startups. And I remember getting that question a lot. It was like, well, why are you interviewing at a place like Google and you're interviewing at our startup at the same time? These are two extremely different jobs. Like, you have
Yeah.
to be decisive about what you want. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess you're kind of right. So I look for, you know, they might have prior startup experience, or they might show signs of doing exploration outside the
Yeah.
boundaries of what their role was. That
Yeah.
they've maybe worked at a job where they've taken on different experiences or
Yeah.
different challenges within their
Yeah.
existing job.
That's good to know. And you talk about like different stages, right? So you said that this is your startup number 6, and you have Vonto, which is 150 people before they got acquired by Symantec, I assume. Then what about the sizes of other company that you join, and what are the differences that you see between different stages of the company?
Yeah. Yeah, it is definitely. There's almost a life cycle of startups, and I had an interesting experience of almost growing backwards through starting at a startup that was about to be acquired, and then going to one that was a D round, I believe at the time. So Lookout Mobile Security had around 100 people, and they were at the point where they were trying to scale their business. They had a really successful consumer business already, and they were trying to figure out how to get into enterprise. And they were also trying to figure out how to handle the number of just physical requests that they were starting to get, the millions of devices that they were installed on at the time. They were having to refactor their entire architecture.
Wow.
So
It's a lot of work.
yeah, so they were having to reformat a team that was mostly doing security and mobile engineering and finding a lot more server side. So adding different kinds of expertise to their team at that time.
So with that said, right, like Vonto is 150, and then Lookout Mobile is 100, and then What about the other companies? Like, what the sizes of those startups?
I went to Trifacta after that, which was a pretty big jump in size. I think they had about 20 or 25 people at the time.
Okay.
And they had a really successful research project that had come out of Berkeley as well as some other universities with this data wrangling solution. And they were taking their initial prototype out to market. So they were bringing in more experienced engineers. They were bringing in people who could manage along with build the technology. They were trying to find product market fit at that time. So it was a lot of exploration with building features that were less research oriented and more market oriented. So that was also kind of an interesting phase to be at with the kind of recruiting they were doing. They had a really smart team of like PhDs and researchers, and they were trying to add experience, like enterprise experience to the team.
Got it. So from 150 to 100 and to 20, like what's the biggest difference in terms of like the type of engineers that you have to be and kind of like the problems you have to solve and what kind of skill set are required?
I think the seed stage is actually the biggest jump, which, you know, when you're just getting off the ground and the team can fit in one small room, you get maybe 10 people or less.
Yeah.
You are building something completely from scratch. You don't have a product yet. You don't have an architecture yet. You don't have customers yet a lot of times. So you're trying to go from that into a repeatable business that you can get follow-on funding for. So the kind of people you recruit at a seed stage are extremely unique individuals.
Yeah.
They're almost like the special ops of of the startup engineering world.
And you said special ops. Could you articulate more? What does that mean?
Yeah, they're comfortable being in a very unknown territory where nothing's been figured out yet.
Yeah.
And their skill sets tend to be like they can do anything. If you ask them to stand up architecture in Amazon, they can do that. They can figure out how to build a new platform, choose what frameworks, run a lot of experiments. Because at that phase, there are technology pieces that you don't even know how they will work yet.
Yeah.
You've got to experiment around with a lot of different tools and APIs that your business might need, and just figure out how they work.
Yeah, so there's a lot of unknowns, and you are willing to do like different pieces of the system, right? I think you mentioned about like this new technology that you never work on. Now you have to work on it, and you have to work on it like super quickly. It's not like a difficult job. Like, why would someone want to join, or like why would someone want to put themselves in such situations as opposed to like a little bit more predictable? Like, okay, like, this is a problem set, you go and solve it, as opposed to like, oh yeah, you know, here's a problem, go and solve it. Like, why would you want to put yourself into that situations?
I suppose it depends on your personality. For me, the question would be, why wouldn't you want to work in that environment? Because the possibilities are endless, and you get to figure out from scratch how to build things. All those times as an engineer where you look at an existing design or setup and you know, rightly or wrongly, you're like, well, why did they decide to do it that way? Like, we could have done this, so they could have done that. All those possibilities are available to you at that stage.
Yeah, and then I think the other downside for startup is compensation-wise, usually more on the equity side than the cash front, like, and then the odds is not in your favor. Right, like usually like the startup fail rate is higher. Like if you work for like a fine company like a Meta, like a Google or Microsoft, like that would be a lot more in terms of return on investment. Like the time you probably don't work like hours, like late hours, and then your pay more predictable and kind of like turn out well. So why would someone go and, you know, take a lower pay job with longer hours? Like, why would you want to do that?
Yeah, I think in terms of the outcome, you have to take a little bit of a leap of faith, because it's true that if you run maybe the Vegas odds on what your outcome would be with the typical startup success or failure rate versus the average salary at a big tech company, the odds probably don't work out on the side of the startup being the more beneficial approach financially, but it could be. you know, if you're successful, you could be in, you know, doing better than working in big tech. But I feel like the real reason, at least for me, the reason I've worked at startups for the past 15 years is that the amount that you learn and grow at a startup is just an order of magnitude greater than working in big tech, because you
Yeah.
get to take on so many different roles, you learn so many different things, you advance at least twice at the rate that you do in big tech. And when you think about it as a tuition cost, you have to calculate in the value to your career and to your life of learning all those things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you gave the example of like going to Las Vegas and do a lottery in a way, in terms of like, take away the aspect of tuition and things. Like it sounds like it is a lottery in a way. So how does an engineer improve their odds? Right. Of course, in Las Vegas probably not much you could do, but I guess for the startup world there's a little bit more that you can control in terms of like the outcome of your result. So how would you improve the odds in your favor? Of course, like all the tuition things, definitely that's something interesting. But at the end of the day, like people have family to feed, have personal needs, right? Like how would you improve your odds in that way?
Yeah, it's with the more that you learn, the more that you experience, the better you are at picking, I think, and realizing companies that are going to be successful. But if I had to give someone advice who was on the earlier side of this in their life, figuring out what startups they might want to work at, just look at the people. Because at the end of the day, a startup is still like a small business. Most of what happens at that company is a product of the people who work there and their culture and perspective. And if you're joining good people that you're learning from every day and you're excited about the business that they have, and you can see that the customers are excited about what they're doing as a business, those are great signals for picking a company that you might enjoy and have a great career at.
That makes a lot of sense. And then you talk about like more junior people. What about like experienced engineers, like who've been there, done that for a couple of years? Like like how would they evaluate, and how would they think about a trade-off actually, right? Like
Yeah.
like the level of stability that they have with like big companies versus like going to the startup. Like how would you manage that conversation? And probably for experienced engineers, they are at the stage in their life where they probably have family and other commitments. Like how would they think about that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I see a lot is that it aligns with that person's larger goals. It's working in a specific domain that they get to either do something new with AI or data or security, in the case of Opsin. And that's where they've been taking their career. So they've been sort of optimizing their learning and their knowledge to work in that area. A lot of times, and it's more the super senior or kind of like the mid-range people who themselves would like to be startup founders someday.
Yeah.
And a great stepping stone to get there is to join like a seed startup where you get to see how everything works from the ground floor. And then you feel much better prepared. In fact, that's what I did in my career. This is my second time as a founder, and I won't hide my strategy. My strategy was to get closer to the front row seats over time so I could learn how it worked and how you did it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you talk a lot about the reason that people should join startup. Like, what are the reasons for them not to join a startup?
Well, I think if you don't enjoy unpredictable things, startups are a rough ride because there's a lot of change, and a lot of times you will be the one who's tapped to figure out how to navigate those changes.
Yeah.
And I think the other piece is if you're a craftsman who really likes to specialize in a certain area, that your career is about being really like the best data lake data
Yeah.
pipeline person or something like that. Those are great technical areas, but generally at a startup, unless that startup is doing something really unique,
Yeah.
specific to that area that you're great at, you're probably more of a generalist at a startup where you're happy to solve different kinds of problems.
That makes sense. And when you talk about evaluating a startup, you talk about different signals from like customers, the teams, and things. So, what exactly kind of like, let's say if someone today wants to work in a startup and talk to a company, like what kind of signals that they should look for? I think you talk about the team, the company, the customers, and all of that. Like, what kind of signal are you looking for, and what kind of question would you be asked? Should you be asking?
Yeah, I definitely look at the founders and just their culture of how they operate the company and how they treat the team and how they collaborate with the team. You want to see people who are good listeners. And I think it's not uncommon for startup founders to be very hard charging people. Like don't have any illusions that they won't be a little bit aggressive in their strategy because they need to. But you also want to look for that EQ, that they know when to slow down and listen and take a different path. They have to have some level of stubbornness to just pound on the brick wall occasionally, but they also need to know when to go around the brick walls. And you also look for people where the company is well connected to its ecosystem. So they've got a good investor who knows them well, who trusts them. They have customers that are good collaborators. And then, of course, you look for your coworkers. You make sure that they're people that you really want to work with day to day.
Yeah. I heard a lot of stories about like startup demanding employees to work. I think last time I read somewhere there is this startup who demands 7 days a week and in person in office. And there's been a debate about the job market overall, right? Like I think there's a lot of like talents out there, and so employer can demand more from the employees. Like if someone look for a job and like how would one think about like the startup culture wise, right? Like because like in the case of the startup that demand people to work 7 days a week, the rationale was like, either you give it your everything and be in it, or you're not. And so that was the rationale. Curious to hear what your thoughts about in terms of the culture wise, and like there is a notorious example about startup being like long hours and hard work and stuff like that. So if you could share more light on that and what you look for in the startup, that would be amazing.
Yeah, it's an interesting and nuanced question. I think that you do see people working harder at a startup, but I think what you want to look for and steer away from is if there are a lot of signs of burnout. You see that the reason why people are working really hard is because they're in a tight spot. They're being kind of pushed forward versus people who are working hard because they're really excited about what they do.
Yeah.
And startups can be sustainable. I don't think that a startup has to be a really painful life sacrifice.
Yeah.
You learn to prioritize and you learn to be. I think like what I found in my career is there's so many distractions in an engineering team, in a startup. In a given day, you'll have maybe 100 events, like signals that come into your brain.
Yeah.
And you have to learn how to avoid or ignore 95% of those signals and focus on the 5 really important things that you need to get done. And if you focus on those really important things and you drive those forward really, really strongly, you don't have to burn out and you don't have to sacrifice time with your family if you work smartly.
Yeah, I think the key is smartly, right? I think it's hard because in startup there's many things for you to do, and figuring out 95% of the noise is the trick, right? I think not everyone can kind of do that. So that get me to the question: if you have to do it again, like starting at the beginning of your career, or maybe like somewhere in the middle of your career, like you're probably the most senior IC in your team and looking to join a startup and things like that. Like, what would you do differently?
So what, like hypothetically, if somebody has a certain career, or what are you thinking with your question?
Well, I'm thinking with my question is that if you go back a couple of years, like before you, like when you were working for a startup, like what would you have done differently? Like, I think one thing that you mentioned is about prioritizing time, right? I think that's important. What else would you be doing differently? Like either picking a startup, either like working and things like that.
Yeah, I think a certain phase of my career, I was probably a little bit overly wrapped up in the technical, I don't know, I want to say philosophy around some of the work that I was doing. And maybe I wasn't listening closely enough to product managers and executives at the company about different things they were seeing at customers and different problems they were having. I definitely fell into that category sometimes of being a very engineering focused person of like, well, the right way to do this would be X and then Y, and maybe missing the point at times about, well, a startup, there's unconventional solutions to a lot of things. So sometimes you need to consider an approach that isn't technically the standard or right engineering thing to do. And that was kind of growth for me of just broadening my perspective beyond just the technical lens and adding other lenses to that.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So maybe a slightly different question. Like let's say someone actively looking for a startup to work on, to work at, like where do they find these startup? And it sounds like the trick is to pick the right one, in the lottery that we talk about. Like, how would someone go about like finding out a startup, picking them, because there could be like a lot of startup out there with various degree of success. Like, how would someone go about like finding and picking more on the discovery and finding startup?
Yeah, I think there are so many startups, so I think it's possible to find something. You probably start with your area of interest.
Yeah.
Don't get too distracted with the one that looks the shiniest or maybe is being advertised the most. Steer your search more towards your personal interests and the kind of technology that you want to work with, the kind of problems that you want to solve. And then when you've narrowed it down to a list of companies that you're interested in, reach out to engineers that work there on LinkedIn or wherever and just ask them to chat, because you'd be surprised. At startups, it's a very sharing culture usually. Those people are happy to talk about what they do and help recruit you if you want to work there. So it never hurts to reach out.
Yeah. I know that you personally are hiring some engineers. Like, what kind of engineers are you looking for?
Yeah, I mean, we've had tremendous success here at Opsin, so we need to level up across the board on our engineering team. We need staff engineers, we need senior engineers, and we need early career engineers as well. People who, if you have experience working with data-heavy applications, things that operate in enterprise, having existing knowledge in things like security and AI is not necessarily a prerequisite, but you should have a strong interest in those topics, because this is the real frontier of where things are now. It's not just the excitement of what AI can do, but it's also the real security and ethical implications of what how to manage all of this technology.
You mentioned about like data security and strong interest. Like, is there any kind of concrete qualities that you're looking for? Like certain years of experiences, certain company sizes that they work with. Like, if you have to think about more kind of concrete criteria to describe. Like, if you look at a candidate profile or resume, like what kind of things that would you be looking for?
Yeah. When it comes to levels like staff and senior, I love to see a candidate who has taken a leadership role in something that they've built before. especially if they've worked at a startup before and they've had to take some part of that system or some feature
Yeah.
and make it successful for the customer, not just internally, but actually make it successful and deliver it. On the more junior side, since we're still small, we look for people who are ready to hit the ground running in a self-sufficient way. We have a great engineering culture here of improving our tools and techniques, and everybody is leaning forward to help. But from a practical perspective, it has to be somebody who's self-sufficient enough to know what to ask for and reach out for the help that they need.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know we went through a lot of questions already. Like, what kind of final thoughts or advice would you have for someone who is listening to the webinar? Like, how would they thrive as an engineer in a startup? So, what kind of advice or final thoughts that you would have?
I think it's a really good era to work at a startup. I feel like there was a little bit of a lull over the past 5 years, maybe, where big tech was a little bit more successful, a little bit more exciting. And some people say that with AI, that the need for engineers is lesser in some way, but I actually don't agree. I think that the need for engineers is intense. It requires a different engineering approach because it's not really about the mundane parts of engineering anymore. Like coding, figuring out how to use different frameworks and tools and coding, there's a lot of assistance that AI can provide for you there. But creative problem solving of problems that haven't been solved yet, I mean, this is something that AI can't really do. And I don't know if it's going to be able to do it in the next decade or two. Of truly coming up with a novel solution to a problem that hasn't been solved yet. That's a very human quality. And that is where startup engineers excel. That's the quality that they have that other types of engineers don't usually have.
That's awesome. For the folks in the audience, feel free to continue to ask questions. I think we had time, so thank you so much for listening. And we'll be back with more of this webinar style where we shed more light on startup engineers, cultures, and all of that. So feel free to tune in later on. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening.